The coffee was already cold when Gareth Nolan decided that Naomi Hurst wasn't worth talking to. She was standing at the folding table near the fellowship hall's east wall, pouring decaf into paper cups and stacking them on a tray with the careful, one-handed precision that had become her habit. Around her, a dozen veterans settled into mismatched chairs, trading jokes and passing plates of scrambled eggs that smelled faintly of the church kitchen's old gas burners. Tuesday mornings at First Methodist in Dunmore, Georgia had looked like this for 6 years. The corner table breakfast, a ritual that cost nothing except a few hours, and a willingness to sit beside someone who understood what it meant to come home changed. Naomi had been volunteering here for 8 months. Nobody in the room knew she was a veteran. She hadn't mentioned it, and nobody had asked. She was just the quiet woman who showed up at 6:30, made the coffee, restocked the napkin dispensers, and occasionally sat with Earl Briggs when his hands shook too badly to fill out his VA paperwork himself. She wore a loose gray cardigan over her volunteer shirt regardless of the weather, and if anyone noticed that her right hand moved differently than it should, that she poured with her left and used the right only for steadying, nobody said anything. Veterans understood the etiquette of not asking about things that showed. She was 28 years old. She looked younger than that, and people tended to treat her accordingly. The fellowship hall's back door opened at 8:15, letting in a gust of November air and Gareth Nolan. He came in like a man who had already decided what the room was worth. Councilman Nolan was 44, built with the particular softness of someone who had spent 20 years at nice dinners, and he wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Naomi's monthly rent. 2 men in similar suits followed him, both carrying leather folders. One of them was taking notes before they'd even crossed the threshold. Nolan surveyed the fellowship hall the way a contractor surveys a building he intends to demolish. His eyes moved from the water-stained ceiling tiles to the folding chairs to the handmade banner above the food table. Corner table. You served. You matter. With the practiced neutrality of a man cataloging deficiencies. Pastor Vernon Ames met him at the door, shaking his hand with the warmth of someone who did not yet understand what kind of meeting this was. Councilman, we weren't expecting you until 9. My schedule opened up. Nolan glanced at his phone. I figured we'd get the visual out of the way. My people need to assess the square footage before we finalize the offer. Pastor Ames's expression shifted, just slightly. The congregation hasn't made any decision yet, Gareth. Of course, of course! Nolan smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows the answer. He raised his voice to address the room with the easy authority of someone accustomed to having it. Morning, everyone! Don't let us interrupt your breakfast. We'll just be taking a few measurements. Most of the veterans looked up. A few nodded. Earl Briggs, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and had heard a lot of politicians talk, went back to his eggs without comment. Nolan made his way along the perimeter of the room, his associates trailing him, murmuring dimensions into a recording app. He passed the resource table, where printed guides to VA housing assistance were fanned out in careful rows. He passed the bulletin board with the photos. Veterans at their jobs, their graduations, their grandchildren's birthdays, small rectangles of proof that coming home was possible. He did not look at any of it. He reached the folding table where Naomi was working. Excuse me. He said it without looking at her, reaching past her to tap the wall. This section here, is this load-bearing? Naomi stepped to the side to give him room. I'm not sure. You'd have to ask Pastor Ames. Right. Nolan finally looked at her. It was a brief look, the kind you give furniture. You work here? I volunteer. His associate wrote something down. Nolan turned back to survey the room and said, still not looking at her. The board is going to want this space cleared for inspection by the 1st. Can you make sure whoever handles logistics knows that the breakfast program will need to find alternate accommodations? The room had gone quiet. Not completely. Earl's fork was still scraping his plate, but the particular quality of silence that falls when people are listening without appearing to. Naomi set down the coffee pot. Alternate accommodations, she said. The program's been here 6 years. Nolan turned to look at her again, and this time the look lasted long enough to carry meaning. The property's been assessed at $2.4 million. Dunmore Community Church has needs that a little breakfast club, with all due respect, can't address. The development will bring 200 permanent jobs to this district. He offered a practiced pause, the kind that said he understood her concern and had already discarded it. There are other church halls in Dunmore. There aren't, Naomi said quietly. We checked. The other spaces either don't have kitchen access or charge fees the program can't cover. If this closes, these men lose the only consistent support resource in a 30-mile radius. Nolan looked at her the way he had looked at the ceiling tiles. I'm sure the city will find a solution. He turned back to his associates. The kitchen footprint is smaller than I thought. Can we get the contractor out here this week? He had dismissed her, not rudely. Gareth Nolan was too politically careful for outright rudeness, but with the specific efficiency of a man removing an obstacle from a mental checklist. Naomi stood with the coffee pot in her hand, and the heat in her face was not from the steam. At the table nearest her, Earl Briggs looked up. His eyes were old and steady. He'd been watching. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The fellowship hall's front door opened. The sound of it was different from Nolan's entrance. Heavier, slower, deliberate. The man who walked in filled the doorframe without quite touching it. Colonel Wyatt Doss was 58 years old, 6'2", and built like someone who had never stopped believing that posture was a matter of character. He wore a dark jacket with a small Marine Corps pin on the lapel, and his silver hair was cropped so close it might as well have been a uniform. His face had the kind of weathered calm that comes from spending decades in places where calm is the only thing standing between you and a very different outcome. At his left side, on a short lead, walked Ranger. The German Shepherd was 9 years old, large even by the standards of his breed, with a coat the color of autumn leaves over black. His vest read retired MWD. Do not pet in white block letters. He moved with the controlled attention of an animal that had spent years learning to read rooms before the people in them could. His dark eyes sweeping the hall with quiet precision. Gareth Nolan saw the colonel and did what men like Nolan always do when they recognize authority. He recalculated. His shoulders shifted. His voice changed register. He was moving toward Doss before the colonel had fully cleared the doorway. Colonel Doss. Nolan extended his hand. Gareth Nolan, City Council. It's a real honor. I know you've been involved with the veterans support community here, and I want you to know that the development we're proposing will absolutely include provisions for veteran outreach in the new facility. Wyatt Doss looked at Nolan's outstretched hand for exactly the length of time it takes to make a man regret offering it. Then he looked past Nolan entirely. At the far end of the room, Ranger had stopped walking. The dog stood at the end of his lead with his head lifted, his nostrils moving in the rapid, subtle way that means a working dog has found something. His ears, which had been forward and alert since they entered, had changed, gone softer, angled back. Doss had seen that posture before. He had learned over 3 years never to interfere with it. Ranger. Doss's voice was low and even heel. The dog did not heel. Ranger turned his head toward the east wall, toward the folding table, toward Naomi Hurst, who was standing with a coffee pot in her right hand and watching the dog with the careful stillness of someone who had been around trained animals and knew that sudden movements were inadvisable. The lead went taut. Ranger. The colonel's command had an edge in it now, not anger, something closer to disbelief. In 9 years, across 3 combat deployments and more training hours than most people spent in school, Ranger had never pulled. Zeus. The stay command. Zeus. Ranger took one step, then another, the lead pulling straight from Doss's hand as the dog crossed the room, with a low, urgent whine building in his chest. The fellowship hall went completely silent. Nolan's associate stopped typing. Earl Briggs put down his fork. Pastor Ames, who had started toward the kitchen, turned back. Ranger crossed the room in 12 steps and stopped directly in front of Naomi Hurst. The dog was enormous up close. His head level with her ribs. He stood there for a moment, just breathing, his nose working. Then the whine in his chest broke open into something almost vocal, and Ranger pressed his massive head against Naomi's left hand, the one not holding the coffee pot, and held it there. Naomi went very still. Her face had gone pale. The dog whimpered again, high and broken, the kind of sound that shouldn't come from an animal trained to go silent in the face of gunfire. He pressed harder against her hand. His tail moved in a slow, heavy arc, once and then again. Then he sank to his haunches at her feet and rested his head on her shoes. Wyatt Doss had been a Marine for 34 years. He had been on the ground in Fallujah, in Helmand, in places that wouldn't make the news for another decade. He had seen things that had rearranged his understanding of what was possible. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man easily shaken. He stood at the far end of the fellowship hall and felt the floor shift under him. "My God," he said. His voice came out different, stripped of something. He hasn't done that since. He stopped. His jaw tightened. He crossed the room in 6 long strides and stopped a foot from Naomi. Up close, he was studying her face with the focused intensity of a man trying to reconcile 2 images that should not belong to the same moment. His eyes moved to her right hand, still holding the coffee pot, and to the way she was holding it, slightly off, the index finger not quite tracking. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was still not entirely his. "He doesn't do this. He hasn't done this. Not since." He stopped again. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph. It was printed on plain paper, the edges worn soft from handling. He held it out to Naomi. She set the coffee pot down. She took the photograph in her left hand. It showed a young man in a Marine uniform, maybe 22, 23, dark-eyed, with the particular brightness in his expression of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide it. He was kneeling beside a younger Ranger, one arm around the dog's neck, grinning at the camera. The photo was taken somewhere with flat, hard-packed earth and an overcast sky. In the background, barely visible, was the canvas wall of a forward operating base tent. Naomi knew the exact shade of that canvas. She knew what the inside of that tent smelled like: iodine and aluminum, and the particular iron sweetness that no amount of training fully prepares you for. She knew what the generator outside sounded like at 2 a.m. when the lights were running on backup power, and you were trying to see clearly enough to close what you'd opened. Her hand began to shake. "That's my son," Wyatt Doss said. "Corporal Daniel Doss. Danny. He was 23 years old when his convoy hit an IED outside Marja. They brought him into the surgical bay at F.O. Brino at 0200 with a thoracic wound that the flight medic called non-survivable." His voice was completely steady. It had the steadiness of something that had been tested. So many times it had become struck. The surgical tech on duty that night didn't agree with that assessment. She kept him on the table for 8 hours. She did not leave when the mortar alarm went off. She did not leave when the second alarm went off. Naomi's eyes were fixed on the photograph. She was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying. She was holding very, very still. "Danny told me," Doss continued, "that when they finally sedated him enough that he stopped fighting the anesthesia, a woman talked to him. She told him his dog was outside. She told him Ranger was fine. She told him to rest because his dad was going to want to see him." He exhaled slowly. He said, her voice was the last thing he heard before he went under. He said it sounded like someone who meant it. Naomi's throat moved. The surgical tech on his record is listed as Specialist N. Hurst, 68 Delta, attached to the 10th Combat Support Hospital. The record shows she sustained a shrapnel wound to her right hand during the second mortar strike and continued operating. His eyes dropped briefly to her right hand, still slightly wrong, still slightly held. She was recommended for a commendation. She was transferred out before it was processed, and the unit rotated home 6 weeks later. By the time Danny was stable enough to ask about her, the trail was cold. He paused. "Ranger was outside the surgical bay that night," Doss said. "For 8 hours, howling. When they finally let him out of his kennel, he didn't go to the medics. He didn't go to the command post. He sat down outside that tent and waited." The seam showed in his voice now, barely, the outline of something very tightly closed for a very long time. "When I brought him home after Danny recovered, he kept searching. I thought he was looking for the fob smell. I thought it was Danny's gear, the specific combination of that place. I was wrong. He looked at Naomi. He was looking for the woman who came out between the alarms and sat with him in the dark and told him Danny was going to be okay. Naomi pressed her left hand flat against the folding table. Danny teaches history now, she said. Her voice came out low and unsteady, like a transmission breaking up. I didn't know. We never know. They don't tell us what happens after. He coaches junior varsity soccer on Thursday afternoons, Wyatt Doss said. He is going to be a father in April. He stopped. He reached out and placed his hand over Naomi's left hand, carefully, the way you do with something that has been through a great deal. He does not know I found you. He made me promise not to spend my retirement running FOIA requests. A brief, quiet, almost smile crossed his weathered face. I'm not particularly good at keeping that promise. At Naomi's feet, Ranger had not moved. His eyes were half closed, his breathing slow, his tail still moving at that same measured, contented pace. The rhythm of a dog who has finally put something down that he has been carrying for a long time. At the other end of the room, Gareth Nolan had not moved either. His associates had lowered their leather folders. One of them had the look of a man reconsidering his career choices. Nolan understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent 20 years reading rooms, that the room had changed. He did not fully understand how. But he understood that the woman by the coffee table was no longer a minor obstacle, and he understood that the colonel had not yet finished. He was right about the second part. Wyatt Doss straightened to his full height. Something in him had resettled. Grief and relief redistributed into something that looked more like resolve. He turned to face the room, and when he turned, it was with the quality of attention a senior officer gives a situation he has just decided is his to handle. His eyes found Nolan. "Councilman," Doss said, "I understand you're planning to acquire this property." Nolan recalibrated. "The development would benefit the entire district, Colonel. The tax base alone." "The property tax base," Doss said, as though noting a minor logical error, "has nothing to do with what I'm about to explain to you." He reached into his jacket and removed his phone. "This building houses the only comprehensive veteran resource access point in Claiborne County. 31% of Dunmore's adult male population over 45 is a veteran. The Corner Table program has assisted with more than 200 VA claims in the past 3 years, including 17 cases that would have been denied without in-person advocacy support." He said this with the calms of someone reciting facts he has taken the trouble to learn. If this program closes, those veterans lose access to benefits they are legally owed. That is not a zoning issue, Councilman. That is a federal access question. Nolan opened his mouth. Doss continued. "I spent the last 6 weeks working with the Regional Veterans Service Office out of Atlanta and 2 members of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. What came out of those conversations is a 30-month pilot grant, federal funding, matched by private foundation support from 3 defense sector donors to expand Corner Table into a full veteran resource center, medical intake, benefits advocacy, mental health referral, peer support coordination. A permanent site." He looked at Nolan with the directness of a man who has aimed at harder targets. "The grant requires an anchor facility of at least 4,000 square feet with commercial kitchen access in Claiborne County. This building is the only eligible site in the county." The associates had stopped writing entirely. Nolan's face did not fall dramatically. Men like Nolan don't allow that. But something went out of it. The specific confidence of a man who had walked into a room knowing the outcome and found a different outcome already installed and waiting. "A grant application is not a property deed," Nolan said carefully. "No." Doss agreed pleasantly. "A federal historic preservation certification is, however, a legal encumbrance that supersedes municipal zoning determinations." He held up his phone, displaying a document with official letterhead. The Fellowship Hall and its attached structures were listed this morning on the Georgia Historic Preservation Register. The listing was processed on an expedited basis, given the building's documented continuous use as a veteran service site since 1987. He offered Nolan a brief, cordial look. You're welcome to have your attorneys review it. I'd suggest allowing them a full week. The language in Section 4 is somewhat involved. Gareth Nolan looked at the phone. He looked at the room. At the veterans who had stopped pretending to eat. At Pastor Ashim standing very straight near the kitchen door. At Earl Briggs watching him with the patience of a man who has waited out worse things than politicians. He looked at the woman by the folding table, the quiet woman with the wrong hand who was looking back at him without expression. He picked up his leather folder from the nearest table. He said something brief to his associates. He walked to the door and closed it behind him with precisely the right amount of force, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for the better part of an hour. Doss turned back to Naomi. He crossed to her and stood again in the measured way he had, close enough to speak quietly in a room that was pretending not to listen. The grant requires a program director, he said. Someone with medical training and experience navigating military healthcare systems. The position pays, not what it should, but considerably more than nothing. He paused. Danny told me that the woman who kept him alive was the kind of person who talks to odds in a crisis because the dog needs someone to tell him it's going to be okay. Another pause. He has always been right about people. Naomi looked down at Ranger, still at her feet, still patient, still present in the way that animals are present when they have decided that you are theirs to look after now. My right hand, she said quietly. I have about 60% function. I can't do surgical work. I couldn't. You won't be doing surgical work, Doss said. You'll be doing what you came here every Tuesday morning to do, just with a salary and a permanent address. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the fellowship hall's narrow windows, the November light was doing what November light in Georgia does in the mid-morning, softening, going gold, making the ordinary look briefly like something worth keeping. Does Danny know you found me? She asked. Not yet. Doss pulled out his phone. I was thinking I'd call him in approximately 4 minutes, but that's your call. Naomi looked at the photograph she was still holding. The young man kneeling with the dog, grinning at whoever was behind the camera with the openness of someone who has not yet learned that everything can change on a single road in a single night. She thought about 8 hours in a canvas tent. She thought about a dog howling outside and going quiet when she knelt beside him in the dark between 2 alarms and told him his person was going to be okay. She had walked away from that tent not knowing if it had been enough. That not knowing had lived in her ever since, in the particular way that unfinished things live in people who care about outcomes they'll never be allowed to see. Tell him, she said. Yes. Ranger stood up when she said it. He pressed against her leg with the uncomplicated certainty of a dog who has finished searching and found what he was looking for, and his tail swung wide and slow, and Naomi Hurst put her left hand on the back of his neck and held on. 14 months later, the Corner Table Veterans Resource Center opened on Clement Street in Dunmore, Georgia. 4,000 square feet of renovated space that smelled like fresh paint and old wood and the same gas burner coffee as always. Naomi stood in the main room on opening morning in a corner table pulso and her familiar gray cardigan, checking the supply inventory on a clipboard, her right hand resting easy on the pen. Ranger sat beside the front desk in a new vest. Service dog, corner table VRC. His eyes on the door, patient and watchful, waiting for whoever needed to walk in. Across the state, in Savannah, Danny Doss was teaching his 3rd period class about the Second World War when his phone buzzed with a photo from his father. The front door of the center, open, November sunlight on the threshold, and in the foreground, the top of a German shepherd's brown-black head. He taught the rest of the class with something on his face that his students would talk about for the rest of the year. The expression of a man who understands, in the specific and untheoretical way of someone who has been close to the edge and come back, that some debts get paid in ways you never planned for, and some people find each other exactly when they're supposed to.